Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our next edition of the Virtual Speaker Series. Our apologies about the lateness. We've had some technical issues tonight, but we are excited and we're glad that everybody's able to join us. So tonight we have Dr. Ruben Puentedura, is the founder and president of Hippasis, an educational consulting firm, and most of us would recognize him from the SAMR model. So we are very excited to have you with us this evening, and we look forward to learning more about how we can integrate technology more effectively using SAMR. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ruben. I'm going to pass my screen over so you are able to present. There you go.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm coming to you today actually from pretty much around halfway around the world. I'm in Bangkok right now. So for me, it's early in the morning. But I'm very happy you all could join me for this virtual hangout. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be talking about the SAMR model. And in particular, I want to take the approach that hopefully will be useful to everybody. In other words, for those of you who are new to SAMR, I'll be covering some new material. I'll be covering the groundwork. For those of you who are familiar with SAMR, I'll be covering some new material as well that you may not have seen before. And I'm going to encourage everybody to use Twitter to ask questions, and I'll take those at the end of the session, as well as introduce you to a few challenges that I put together for today's session. So I'm going to start showing my screen now. So let me go ahead and do that.
And while you're doing that, Ruben, I didn't mention the hashtag for tonight. So the hashtag is eLearnOnt, O-N-T, and we'll be accepting questions through that.
All right. Let me check. You should all now be seeing my screen. Is that correct? Excellent. So as I said before, what we're going to be doing is putting SAMR in context. And let's start with the model itself. Okay. So this is the SAMR model, which I believe is familiar to many of you, which recognizes 4 levels of progressively greater impact upon student outcomes according to how you're using technology. Now, the first thing I want to emphasize here is that there's a way of looking at this that can help you start to see how and why the model works, which is the following. You can think of the model as the intersection of 2 strands. One strand is the strand of the technology. The technology always replaces an older technology with a newer technology that has different affordances, some affordances that the old technology didn't have, for instance. So you might be looking at replacing a paper book with an ebook, and the paper book and the ebook compare how? Well, the ebook can, of course, highlight passages like the paper book did. You can annotate passages like the paper book did, but it also has some new affordances, some new aspects, such as the fact that you can run a speech synthesizer from it, so you can hear your text read out loud, such that what other affordances does it have? Well, for instance, you can aggregate all your highlights, annotations, etc. In the back of the ebook, and then have access to everything you annotated, everything you highlighted in one convenient location to look at, use, etc. So with that in hand, then, we can see the first of those strands. In other words, we have an old technology, we bring in a new technology to replace it or run side by side with it in such a way that it has different capabilities, new capabilities the old one didn't have. The second strand, though, which is just as important, in fact, in some ways even more important, is what happens with your teaching practice. Does it remain the same as what it was before? Is it changed in some way? Or is it completely new? Are you doing completely new things? So with that second strand, then, you have the other component that merges then or intersects with that technology strand to give you the 4 levels of SAMR. The 2 levels: enhancement, substitution, where you bring in the technology to do exactly the same thing that the old technology was doing, but you don't change anything pretty much about your practice. Augmentation, where you bring a tool, you keep the practice pretty much the same, but you improve some aspects of it based upon some new features, new affordances of the tool. And then the 2 upper transformation levels: modification, where you start to significantly change your practice based upon what the tool can do, even as you keep the heart of the practice the same. And finally, redefinition, where you're creating new tasks. In other words, you're creating new aspects to your practice that you did not do before. As you go up these 4 levels, you see progressively greater impact upon student outcomes. But it's important to realize, I'm going to stress this now and I'll reiterate this later, that there is nothing wrong with any given level. The substitution level, for instance, can set a very valuable base for building upon it with other uses at higher levels. So there's nothing wrong with it. The only thing is that you should be aware of that if you're using the tool at the substitution level, there is little to no impact upon student outcomes. All right. So with that in hand, that's the basic layout of the model. Let's look at an example, again, for those of you who are newcomers to the model. And I'm going to start then with a course that I'm going to assume is in English literature at the substitution level. Let's assume I'm teaching Sherlock Holmes, okay? And when I'm teaching Sherlock Holmes, the first question you might want to ask is, why am I teaching Sherlock Holmes? And one of the very good reasons to teach Sherlock Holmes, aside from the fact that it's interesting, it's fun, the stories have certain interesting aspects of mechanics and so on, is also the fact that Sherlock Holmes is the single most re-represented character in all of English literature. That means that you can find more versions of Sherlock Holmes in video, in movies, in theater, etc., than you can of any other character in all of literature. Which tells you that you have something interesting here going on, not just in terms of the literary aspects of the stories of Arthur Conan Doyle, but also in terms of the intersection of what you have in the literary aspect with the media aspect, with the translation into other media, and also, therefore, what you can do in terms of studying how that translation process works, what it tells you about how media works, and so on. So at the substitution level, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to, of course, have students read the Sherlock Holmes stories. You can get them now for free from the Gutenberg project, and of course you can read them in your ebook reader, you can annotate them, you can highlight them, but that's straight substitution. At the same time, though, I'm also going to ask the students to look at Sherlock Holmes in different media. So for instance, one student might choose to look at Sherlock Holmes in the persona that Benedict Cumberbatch brings to the table. Another one might choose to look at Jeremy Brett. A third one might choose to go further afield with something like Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century. Yet another might decide to go even further afield and say, well, let's look at House and what happened with how the idea of Holmes was transmogrified in House. So this is the other thing I'm doing at the substitution level. I'm having the students explore media because there's a wealth of media out there. I'm going to both have a common set of elements of media that I'm going to ask them all to look at, but I'm also going to ask them to follow their interest, their particular bit of curiosity, if you will, in terms of some other elements of media they might look at. Again, straight substitution, though. I could have done this with a good DVD library, or even earlier a tape library at my school library, but right now, of course, I have this all available online. All right, I've got this, I've set the stage. What do I do at the next level then? At the next level, which is augmentation, I say, okay, you know what? I want my students to be able to really get deep into the heart of the stories, understand how they work, their logic, their mechanics, the formal aspects, how Conan Doyle engages your interest, and so on. So here I'm going to use tools that are going to help students do just that. At the top you see a Wordle, for instance. A Wordle, remember, highlights words, makes them bigger in a particular layout according to how prominent they are within the context of your text. So I can have students, for instance, compare the stories that are more Sherlock-centered with the ones that have more of Watson in them, and see if there are differences there that automatically leap out when you look at the patterns seen in the Wordles. Or, to look at another aspect, look at the bottom one. At the bottom, we have a concept map that's being drawn to establish what the connections are, relationships, etc., between the different characters in A Study in Scarlet. By the way, this isn't just quickly thrown together. This is really what you get if you start doing this process of mapping out connections, relationships between characters in A Study in Scarlet. Now, at first sight, you might say, well, Ruben, that's looking pretty substitutive, right? I mean, you could have done that on pencil and paper. But here's where you need to remember that concept maps, when you do them digitally, have additional possibilities, additional affordances that are not available in the paper domain. So for instance, I can hyperlink each arrow connecting the characters to the place in A Study in Scarlet where the characters actually meet. I can also cross-connect this with media, so I can link in images, video, etc. Remember, that was part of what I wanted to do. So I can also incorporate that into the digital domain in a way in which it would be very difficult to do in the paper domain. Perhaps even more importantly, I can cross-connect different concept maps. So I can have one concept map that shows me the characters, and a second concept map that starts to show some of the mechanics of how the story progresses, and then cross-connect the links between characters to the links that define how the story moves. These are things I could not do with paper. These are true functional improvements over what I could have done with paper. So these tools help my students better understand the stories, better find their way through them. And I should expect to see, if I were now to measure how well my students are doing here, how well they're understanding Sherlock Holmes, etc., I should expect to see some small but still measurable improvements over what I would have seen in a traditional course where I would just be asking them to read the paper and would not have all of these augmentative tools available to me. Great. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is now I can build further upon this, and I can say, okay, let's do something now that is something I would have done in the traditional course, but let's significantly modify it. What am I going to do? Well, in the traditional course, I would have asked students to write short essays as we went through the course, to have them do two things. First, so they could say, okay, let me summarize what I've understood up till now. Let me better clarify my thoughts. So the short essays have this function to help students take a deep breath and say, okay, what have I understood? Let me put it out there in the form of a short essay. At the same time, they fulfill a second important function, which is to give me an element that I can use for formative assessment. Because I could read these short essays as the course went on, and I could then say to the students, okay, you've understood this not so much, here's what you want to be thinking about. In other words, both see where the students are at, see where the students should be, and see what type of assistance or suggestions I could make to them to get them from one point to the next. That's what I would have done in the traditional course. So what I'm going to do now is to say, okay, how am I going to modify this so it better responds to the fact that my course now incorporates the media aspect I mentioned earlier in a way that leverages the technology as effectively as possible. So I think about this and I say, you know what? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a medium where the integration of visual media and text is a natural. So instead of asking the students to write short essays, I'm going to ask the students to create short digital comics, much with the same type of subjects, focus, etc. of the earlier essays, but now I'm going to ask them to integrate media with text. And any of you, of course, who has ever done serious work with comics knows that comics are not just text with pretty pictures, but rather a new medium, a new domain that emerges from the synthesis, from the interaction of both. So it is ideally suited to an analysis of Sherlock Holmes in the context of media. For more, by the way, about these aspects of comics, I strongly recommend MacLeod's work on understanding comics and his other books. So I'm going to have the students do this, and I'm going to make one additional redesign to the task. Not only am I going to shift from short essays to mini comics, but in addition to that, I'm going to ask the students not to just turn these into me. Okay, so if I just ask them to email these mini comics to me, well, that would be the same as turning it in on paper. In other words, that aspect would be at the substitution level. So instead, I'm going to say, no, I'd like you to post these to a blog. But the reason I want you posting these to a blog is not just to make it easier for me to read them. It will do that, of course, and I will, of course, provide feedback on them. But because I want each of you to be reading, shall we say, 4 of your fellow classmates' mini comics and providing commentary to that, saying not just, oh, well, that was a nice comic, but things like, I agree with you about Holmes here. I don't agree with you about those characters in A Study in Scarlet, and here's why. I didn't understand your point you were trying to make about Inspector Lestrade. Could you clarify that? In other words, to have them engage each other in a conversation mediated by their blogs, because of course I don't want the students just reading that feedback. I want them replying to it, maybe editing their comic, re-editing their comic, creating other mini comics in reply. In other words, I'm also shifting not just from mini essays to mini comics, I'm also shifting from individual writing to social writing. And one thing that we know is that when we ask students to do social writing, we give them a powerful, authentic audience that drives them to do their very best to do some of their most powerful work. So that's what I do at the modification level. Great. This is a significant task redesign. It keeps the heart of the old task, mind you, of the old mini essays, but there's a significant redesign that makes it more appropriate to what I want to accomplish in a way that's mediated by the new technology. And I should expect to see more significant impact upon student outcomes now. All right, now I'm at the end of my course. And I want to say, okay, you know, what I used to do in the Sherlock Holmes course was to ask students to either take a big final exam or write a much longer expository essay. And that would be okay, I suppose. But let's really create something new. So here I'm not going to retain the old task. I'm going to create a new task. It still has to accomplish everything the old major essay or the final exam would have. So I want the elements for assessment. I want this synthesis of everything the student has seen. And I want them, of course, conveying their understanding of this interaction between Sherlock Holmes and media and a more general understanding of what happens in terms of how these interactions work in a broader field of media and literature as a whole. So I say, well, okay, suppose I wanted the students to convey from within their understanding of the mechanics of what happened with Conan Doyle's stories and how those translate into media. Now, one temptation is to ask the students, okay, why don't you create your own Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes story or create your own video or what have you. The trouble with that is it tends not to work very well. It's time-consuming, and frankly, the student skills in terms of their literary creative writing skills tend to get in their way of expressing clearly what's going on. So instead I'm going to ask the students to do something else, where they're going to be acting as mentors to somebody else, conveying their understanding of what they got from Sherlock Holmes. I'm going to ask them, instead of creating a short story or even a video, I'm going to ask them to create a short game whereby the player, by playing the game, would be drawn into an understanding of the mechanics of Sherlock Holmes. In other words, the game is designed to be a teaching tool for others. Now, first things first. This is a great exercise because it puts the students in the position not just now of having an authentic audience, but of being mentors to that audience. And again, this is where we see the most powerful thinking by students, the most powerful creation by students, because not only do they have to just lay it out, shall we say, as they would for an expository essay in terms of what they understood and so on, they have to think about how would somebody come to an understanding of this. What type of pitfalls might they run into? How would my game help them both see the pitfalls but also develop an understanding of how to navigate around those pitfalls, misunderstandings, and so on? So it's a great task from that perspective, and it accomplishes more than my old tasks did. Of course, if the students have done this well, it will also accomplish all the tasks I had before. In other words, I'll be able to see, did the students really understand Sherlock Holmes? Did they understand these aspects of the interaction between media, Holmes, and how the formalism of the stories work, how the mechanics of taking a reader through the thinking process, deduction process, etc., works in this regard. One more thing, though. A lot of people say, well, that sounds lovely, Ruben. That sounds great. And yeah, those are great advantages, but it's going to take so long for students and teachers to learn how to use the tool. It really can't be a very good way to do this, a huge investment of time. And the answer is, well, the tool you're seeing here is called Twine. And Twine, I find I can teach teachers and students how to use it in the following way. It takes me about 20 minutes to introduce them to how the tool works and what the games that you create with Twine look like. Another 20 minutes for the teachers and students to go through a quick tutorial, and another 20 minutes for them to create their own first, quick and dirty short story game using the tool. So in 1 hour's time, you can have your students and teachers really up to speed using this tool. By the way, the tool is free and it's browser-based, so it can be used on any platform, and the stories can be enjoyed by anybody on any platform, just so long as they have a web browser available to them. So it's in fact a very time-efficient tool in terms of giving students a medium for expressing their thinking, their understanding, etc., without having to invest large amounts of time in acquiring a tool that might be very, very difficult for them to use or understand. I'll mention at this point that all the slides you're seeing will be, or are already, I should say, available for download from my website. I'll show you the address to that at the end of this talk. And when you see, if you download these slides, when you see this slide, if you click on this image, this will take you to a tutorial I wrote for Twine. I wrote it for a slightly older version of Twine, but most of the tutorial still holds. And you'll find, I think, as I mentioned, that it's quite easy actually for teachers and students to create learning games using this technology. So what you've seen now here is how we use the technology in this particular scenario of the Sherlock Holmes course at 4 progressively higher levels of SAMR. I think also you've seen that there was no bad level. I never threw away what I did at another level. In other words, what was done at substitution was used to build upon augmentation. What was done at augmentation was used to build upon at modification, and finally redefinition built upon all of the preceding. So this is what I call a SAMR ladder. Each step has progressively greater impact, but each has its own value. There is no such thing as a bad level or a level that you use once while you're learning and then you throw it away. All of them retain value. It also should give you an idea for how a teacher who is a newcomer to the technology might progress. So a teacher who's a newcomer might, for instance, think of something like this, but the first year, say, just try the tool at this substitution, maybe some of the augmentation uses. Be comfortable there. Then the rest of the course is taught traditionally, so the students would still write their mini essays, and in addition to writing their mini essays, they take the final exam, say. Then the next year, the teacher might say, okay, now let's try doing the comics, and if that works out, then the year after that, they might do the redefinition level activity. So the next thing that you should be able to see whenever you think of SAMR and SAMR ladders is that SAMR ladders give you a way of thinking about how you might progress, evolve your practice, so you're not in the scenario of saying, I just got introduced by a technology, must I do everything at redefinition right away? No. You can take your time. You can get to levels as you feel more comfortable, as you become more familiar with the technology. Another question I frequently get about SAMR ladders is this the exact way you should always do? Should you always start at substitution, then build upon that with augmentation, etc., etc.? And the answer is, again, no. For some cases, you might leap straight to a modification level activity, or another course might use the technology primarily at augmentation. And again, it's a question of what's reasonable, what's feasible, what's most appropriate for your learning goals at that point in time. But I do want to emphasize one thing that's very nice about SAMR ladders. If you follow the steps involved in a SAMR ladder, you'll find that you have what I would call a safety net. In other words, suppose you went through all of this in the Sherlock Holmes course, and something happened at the redefinition level. It turns out that maybe there's a bug in the current version of Twine, and suddenly teachers and students weren't able to get their games finished as quickly as they wanted to, so they had to go on to other things. So the redefinition level really didn't work as well as you might have wanted. Fine. But you can realize then and say, wait a second, but I still have everything I gained at the other levels. In other words, going through a SAMR ladder means that as you go higher up the ladder, reaching towards the more ambitious, but also, yes, more risky levels, if something goes wrong, you still have all the gains you've made up to that point. So a SAMR ladder also provides a safety net, if you choose to follow it, in the sense that anything that goes wrong at an upper level, you didn't lose everything up to that point because the other levels had worth value of their own. And that's something else to keep in mind. But again, I want to emphasize that there is no necessary aspect to a SAMR ladder. You know, when I'm teaching a course, some things might look more SAMR ladder-like, but others might look like, okay, so 2 uses at substitution that converge upon a use at augmentation, which branches out into 3 different uses at modification, and 2 of them reconverge upon redefinition, etc. It might be a much more complex diagram, and as teachers' practice evolves, that's typically what you see. But to get started, to have the safety net, to see the worth of each level, to become familiar with the technology, SAMR ladders are a very good way to start. And I wanted to close out this section by reiterating something I said at the beginning, which is SAMR is not intended to make value judgments. It doesn't say substitution, augmentation, bad, modification, redefinition, good. No, there's nothing like that. Rather, it says, look, as you go up the levels, you'll see more impact upon student outcomes. But what level is appropriate at what point in time has to be determined by your learning goals and, frankly, your comfort with practice. I'd much rather have somebody say do very good work at the augmentation level than a very rushed, poorly thought out, poorly designed redefinition level task. So really being comfortable, being able to do things solidly well in a well-grounded manner is crucial to getting the maximum mileage out of the technology. All right, so that's SAMR. And again, for those of you who were familiar with it, I hope you probably hadn't seen this example before, but for those of you who weren't, I wanted to make sure everybody was clear on the same page about it. Now, this is SAMR. SAMR tells you how to use the technology, but one of the questions you might have is, okay, Ruben, but you know what? I look in any catalog out there for educational tools that I might look at, and I see not tens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of ed tools. How do I know which ones to choose? Well, because that's an important question, I did some research that was based by the Horizon Project. The Horizon Project identifies 2 technologies in the short term, 2 technologies in the medium term, and 2 technologies in the long term each year that are of particularly proven value to education and that have particularly long-term impact and projected even more important future impact as well. And what I did was I analyzed about 10 years worth of data, and I found there were 5 categories of technologies that accounted for all of the tools identified both as most important by the Horizon Project as well as the runner-ups. So these 5 categories give you a map, if you will, for which tools you might choose and why, and which ones you should prioritize, if you will, when you're looking at different tasks. So what you see now on screen are these 5 categories. You may be wondering, those pictures don't look very digital. They look like other things. And the timeline's 200,000 years ago. Geez, I didn't know we had laptops or smartphones or tablets 200,000 years ago. No, we didn't. And if you're interested more in that, again, when you download the slides, there's a link to a YouTube presentation where I explain parallels between these 5 categories and key elements, key steps, if you will, in the story of how we came to be, well, who we are today. But that's not crucial for today's presentation, so I'm just going to leave that for people to explore if so they wish. Instead, I'm just going to go into what the 5 categories are and briefly what their uses might be. So social tools are the tools that we use to create jointly, to share what we create, to communicate with each other, etc. So everything from email to blogs, wikis are social tools, to also tools such as the one we're using today, Google Hangouts. Mobility tools refer to the fact that the devices we're using, whether they're smartphones, laptops, tablets, etc., are not static. They can be taken and used at different locations in different places. And because of that, we don't need to constrain ourselves to just thinking about, okay, is this schoolwork or is this homework? We can start to think about learning experiences that use the devices anytime, any place. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, any place that might be appropriate. One experience might be appropriate in the classroom, another one at home, but another one might be on the soccer field, or it might be appropriate at the coffee shop. And some experiences might be something the student does on a daily basis. Others might be things that the student just does once, but not necessarily in traditional times. So this is a very important aspect that's opened up by the mobility features of the technology. Visualization refers to the following idea. We have abstract concepts. Abstract concepts can be tricky, sometimes complex for students to understand, to use, to represent to others in turn. So visualization tools say, look, here's an abstract concept. We can take that abstract concept and make it tangible by representing it in 2 or 3 dimensions. So for instance, if I have a big set of numbers, if I now represent those numbers as a graph, I have made whatever patterns are involved in those numbers more easily accessible, more tangible. Or think about that Sherlock Holmes example we just looked at. With that Sherlock Holmes example said, well, the relationships between characters in Sherlock Holmes stories are tricky things because the relationship between the characters, the structure of the stories, etc., are abstract concepts. Well, by using a concept map, we make them more tangible and therefore make them easier for the student to understand, to use and to re-represent in their turn. So that's the key element of visualization technologies. And there are many ones, again, but the crucial ones are visualizations of time, like digital timelines, visualizations of space, digital maps, visualizations of the connections between things, such as the concept maps we were looking at earlier, and also finally visualizations of numerical ideas, graphs, charts, diagrams, and also visualizations of textual information like that wordle I showed you before. Digital storytelling, it refers to the capacity to use the tools that we have in the digital domain to capture different sort of media and integrate it into a story. So we can capture audio, video, stills, text, interactivity even, as in the case of that game I was talking about in my earlier example, and make it something that I use to tell a story. Fine, but why should this be so powerful? Well, think about what happens when I'm telling a story, no matter whether the story, by the way, is in the digital or in the traditional domain. When I tell a story, I'm trying to make meaning for somebody else. But to make meaning for somebody else, I have to make meaning for myself. And that's what's so powerful about storytelling of all sorts, and in particular, in this case, digital storytelling. I am making meaning for others, and in doing so, clarifying, making meaning for myself. And of course, there's a huge range of digital storytelling. You know, a lot of people always think of digital video, and yes, that is a form of digital storytelling, but there's also digital comics, like I showed you, interactive games, like that example I showed, etc. Finally, digital gaming. And a lot of people say, okay, yeah, we've heard that gaming can have powerful use in education. Is it because games are fun? Turns out that that fun aspect is the least important bit. Yes, it is nice if kids have fun with a game, but frankly, educational games that are driven primarily from the fun side don't do very well at all. In fact, some of them have failed rather severely. So why are games powerful? Well, games are powerful because they have something in common with novels. Okay, novels, what are you talking about? Well, think about, why do you read a novel? And in literary theory, we say, well, a novel sets up a conflict, and because you want to resolve the conflict, remember, conflict here doesn't mean a fight, it means something that's unresolved, right? Because you want to resolve that conflict, you read through the novel. So because of the situation set up in the opening of, say, I don't know, Anna Karenina or Sherlock Holmes or whatever, you read through Anna Karenina or Study in Scarlet, etc., because you want to see how that conflict that's set up at the opening of the novel is resolved by the end of it. So the conflict drives you to read the novel. Similarly here, in terms of gaming, a conflict is set up, but instead of reading a game, you play the game to resolve it. So when you're, for instance, playing SimCity, okay, the conflict that's set up is, can you set up a city that won't collapse on itself? Can you set up the greenest city, the richest city, the biggest city, and make it thrive? That's the conflict. You resolve it by playing. But in playing that, you have to understand something more about cities. And in every study that's ever been made of the uses of SimCity in education, students have learned much more from playing SimCity than they would have if they had just used visualization tools. And of course, using visualization tools in turn helps them learn much more than if they had just been told facts and tables of numbers about cities. So that's what drives gaming, that desire to resolve a conflict that's analogous to what happens in literature. So these 5 are the key categories. So when you're thinking about how do I choose which technologies to use, well, think about your goals. Once you've thought about your goals, look at the appropriate category. And again, just so you can have a quick overview, these are the key practices associated with each technology. I've just mentioned them. So you have this as a quick summary. So look at the type of practice you're trying to encourage in your classroom, then go to that category of tools for where to look for the technology assist that's most relevant to your challenge. Let's do another quick second SAMR ladder just to show you all of these tools again in action a little bit more. Suppose I'm going to teach a course on climate change. Now, the thing about climate change is it's a very interesting phenomenon because one of the things about it is that you have to think about systems. And systems are things that it turns out all of us have difficulty in thinking about. And the systems group at MIT in particular was a pioneer in this arena, saying, well, How do we get people to think about what happens, for instance, when you're putting large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere? How do you think about it? Why do you realize? How do you come to realize that you can't just say, okay, now I'm going to take it out and say, whoops, that doesn't quite work? Why is there a lag time before you see effects and so on? So at the substitution level, I want students to come to understand some of these aspects of system dynamics. I'm going to, instead of going for traditional textbooks, I'm just going to look at some of the wonderful materials available online. And then here I have two examples. There's a great course at MIT OpenCourseware that is created by Jay Forrester, who was, of course, the founder of all of this area and the director of the systems group at MIT. It's a wonderful course, appropriate for a broad range of ages. For younger students, you might need to help them with aspects of it, but for high school students, there should be no problem whatsoever. I'll get them to an understanding of basic system dynamics. And then there are also some excellent videos out there that connect system dynamics to other aspects. So for instance, at the bottom, you see a video that was created by UBC. And that video that was created by UBC starts to, again, incorporate aspects of system dynamics, now not in an abstracted fashion, but targeting this type of climate change that I was mentioning earlier. So straight substitution, though. Everything here could have been done by traditional books, DVDs, etc. But still, it gives me access to a richness of material upon which to ground what comes next. So now, at the augmentation level, I'm going to use games for exactly that aspect I was talking about before, except that instead of looking at the dynamics of cities here, I want students to understand systems in general, to have a broader perspective upon systems. This particular game is called Transport Tycoon, and it's a great game for getting students to understand flows and, stocks and flows in dynamical systems. Stocks are where things accumulate, flows occur from one place to another. Well, this game leverages modeling based upon system dynamics, but also visually conveys those concepts of things like, well, things accumulate at the warehouse, things get taken, flow from one warehouse to another via trucks. In other words, at once, it both allows students to start to apply some of those concepts driven by that aspect that I mentioned about games before. So apply some of those concepts of system dynamics, but also visualize them in certain key ways. So now I've got the students getting a deeper understanding of system dynamics. So at this point, I'd like them to go from playing with models created by others to making their own models. So at the modification level, I'm going to give them a tool for studying system dynamics. This tool is Stella. There are others, but I like Stella very much. And what you see here, for instance, is me recreating a classical model for gas exploration, pricing, and so on. So again, when you're trying to understand climate change, you're saying, well, what about alternative energies and so on? Well, you have to understand the systems that are involved in the development, commercialization, distribution, etc. of alternative energies. And Stella here is allowing me to recreate that model and now to change it, to start asking what-if questions. So I start to say, well, what if, say, we had a carbon tax that would then make some fuels more expensive relative to others? What would that do to the development? Of course, different students might choose different systems. So I might have another student that says, well, fine, I understand the system in this context, but I want to explore other systems of interest to them. So they might be looking at systems that focus more on the technological side, some on the economic side, some on the ecosystem side, etc. But the key thing here at the modification level is that the tool allows for a significant task redesign. It's not just students reading and hearing about these and just having just the systems or the simulations made by others, like we had in that game at the augmentation level. They can make their own, driven by the combination of the topic at hand with their particular interest focus. So now what do I do at redefinition? Well, at redefinition, once again, I've asked my students to do a lot of work that is not just, okay, did you understand the basics of system dynamics in this context? I've asked them to do, particularly at the modification level, work that says, hey, you found out maybe something new or something different, or creating these models would lead you to certain suggestions. Why don't you share that with an audience who may not be as well versed in system dynamics as you, the student, are at this point in time? So at the redefinition level, I'm going to ask the students not to take an exam on system dynamics, but instead to create a short video on one aspect of system dynamics in the context of climate change that will be used to share with others, to introduce both some basic concepts of system dynamics as well as what the student has found through their simulations to a broader audience. So once again, I'm leveraging that mentorship aspect I mentioned before. Now here's where sometimes people say, so does redefinition always involve mentorship? Oh, no, of course. It can involve many different things. But it is a particularly powerful avenue that's now opened up for us by the technology that was not always available to us before, and hence I like to explore it as much as possible. So that's what I'm doing at redefinition. Again, the students will be editing, re-editing this video in response to feedback, commentary that they'll get. So not only will they be creating a tool for mentoring others, they'll be creating a tool that will be refined, become better as they get feedback, and in getting that feedback, of course, also help refine that student's understanding of the subject. All right, so that was the second aspect that I wanted to highlight here. So what tools do you want to use? But there's one last aspect I wanted to touch upon before we wrap up for today, and that's the aspect of, okay, fine, so we have these tools, we have, that I mentioned in that set, what I call the EdTech Quintet, those 5 categories are particularly useful. We saw how to use them in SAMR. How do we integrate, though, or how do we best integrate pedagogy, content knowledge, and technology, though? And that's a great question, and it's one that, to address, I find that the model that works best is Mishra and Kohler's TPAC model. And you see here the TPAC model on screen. What Mishra and Kohler found is that if you look at content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and technological knowledge, the best results you get are when you're thinking of all 3 as peers to each other. So you don't just say, let's start with content, and then I'll figure out some pedagogy and technology to deal with that content. Rather, you're thinking at the same time as content, you're thinking, well, what content would be most powerful for my students to learn? What would be the most powerful pedagogy to most effectively convey that content? And what technologies make that pedagogy possible? In other words, you don't lock yourself into content that might be, well, okay, but not necessarily the best or most useful or content with the greatest impact upon other things that your students would learn. So you don't lock yourself in too early. Rather, you want to think about all 3 of these at the same time. And that's an important aspect of TPAC, and it tells you something, again, about how you want to bring the technology into the context. But we can get further mileage from TPAC. We can get further mileage by noticing that when you lay it out as a Venn diagram here, there are, in addition to the pure content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and technological knowledge areas, there are 4 more areas, 3 binary intersections, and then 1 ternary intersection that result from the interaction of these areas. And those are areas that become particularly important to focus on as we use the technology at progressively higher levels of SAMR. Let's see how this all plays out. So, at the substitution level, really the major support I need is on the technological side, and not so much technological as what I would call technical support. In other words, knowing, if you will, how do I do a dissolve in iMovie, or how do I edit this digital comic. In other words, it's knowing how the tools work. That's the key support, the key focus that is needed to support work at the substitution level from a TPAC perspective. As we go up the ladder, though, we start to draw more upon other areas of knowledge, and if we're looking at professional development, other areas of support. So at the augmentation level, now, to be able to use the technology most effectively at this level to make the most powerful pedagogical decisions, learning decisions, teaching decisions, etc., at the augmentation level, I need to have good knowledge in each of the 3 pure areas. Content knowledge, what I'm teaching; pedagogical knowledge, how people learn, how I might teach a given aspect of something; and technological knowledge, which now goes beyond the technical, because it's not just how does the tool work, but how does the tool work to a given end. So it's not how do I insert a dissolve in iMovie, if you will. It becomes more how do I use iMovie to make a digital movie, or how do I use Wordle to visualize patterns in text. And that's great. This type of knowledge in these 3 areas supports the work I do at augmentation. As I go up the SAMR ladder, though, now the intersection areas start to become particularly relevant. So at the modification level, We are looking to see what's going on in these three areas to fully ground, fully support what it is that I'm doing. And the intersection areas need to be discussed a little bit to see what they mean. PCK is a very important one. PCK is pedagogical content knowledge, and this was identified first by Schulman, even before Mishra and Köhler did their work. In fact, Schulman's work was one of the inspirations for Mishra and Köhler's work. And Schulman said, look, pedagogical content knowledge is the knowledge that a teacher has of a given content area such that they can represent it, modify its presentation, transform its presentation, contextualize it in such a way that a student can then better understand that content area, use that content area, and re-represent it in turn. So that's PCK knowledge. It's not just pure pedagogy or pure knowledge of the content. It's rather, how do I, the teacher, transform, recontextualize, represent this content so that the student can better understand it and use it. And it's one of the reasons why whenever you hear somebody say, oh, you know, in the future we'll just have video and we won't need teachers, they couldn't be more wrong, because this is what a teacher brings to the table. A teacher who is interacting with students, whether face-to-face or online, however that class is working, on a day-to-day basis, develops that knowledge and says, for this student or this group of students, how do I contextualize this unit of content? It isn't a static thing. It's something that depends upon the interaction between teachers and students, and it's a very, very important skill, and one that grounds good practice at the modification level. TPK is how do technologies, technological pedagogical knowledge, is how do technologies make certain pedagogies possible. So we have a technology, and we say, okay, so how does, say, a blog make social writing possible? A wiki also makes social writing possible. So another bit of TPK is not just which tools make which pedagogical approaches possible, but how do they differ? Turns out a blog tends to foster social writing that's based upon authorship, whereas a wiki tends to foster social writing that's based upon the document as the key core element. So again, that's technological pedagogical knowledge. How are certain technologies making possible certain pedagogies that might not have been possible otherwise before? Finally, TCK is technological content knowledge. How are units or areas of content being transformed by the introduction of technology? We don't do history the same way we did even 10 or 20 years ago. Any good historian these days uses databases of documents, text analysis tools in their craft. We don't do math the way we did decades ago. Most mathematicians use tools as useful, computer tools for useful visualization, but in some cases go beyond that to actually use symbolic math tools to aid them in the development of new mathematics. We want to convey how different content areas have been transformed to our students, because after all, we want our students not just hearing about history, say, we want them being historians, developing the tools to use and understand history in their own way. But we'd like them to do it the way history is done now, not the way it was done 30 years ago. So these three intersection areas inform the type of task you might undertake at the modification level. Finally, at the redefinition level, you have the three-way intersection of TPAC, and the three-way intersection of TPAC can best be defined as when do you get that optimal intersection I mentioned before, when content, pedagogy, and technology are optimally integrated with each other to give you the most effective set of choices, the most effective choice among all the content you could choose to teach in a particular subject, that content which is going to have the greatest impact upon students, the pedagogy that most effectively conveys the content, and the technology that most effectively supports that pedagogical approach. It's important to realize that this, of course, I'm talking about it here from the perspective of the teacher, but it's also, TPAC is also from the perspective of the student, how the student can best come to understand that, how they themselves make this meshing for their own purposes. And this type of work from both the teacher and student side is what's involved at the redefinition level, at the redesign level. That's at the creation, of a new task that's involved at the redefinition level. So this shows you the intersection, the interaction between TPAC and SAMR, and the type of information that would help support the work you might do at each level. One last comment. When you go from the pure areas at augmentation to those intersections at modification and redefinition, you're making a shift from things that can be informed directly by what you see, as opposed to things that, well, involve recognizing patterns from the interaction of different things. So sometimes I'll get people saying, you know, I see how SAMR works, but I find it's much easier to go from substitution to augmentation than from augmentation to modification. And that's correct, because you're going from something that involves simply saying, okay, from my content knowledge, I know that this content at the augmentation level can best be presented this way. Or from my pedagogical knowledge, I know that this, say from how people understand data, this chart will help people understand data. When you go to modification and redefinition, you're looking at the intersection, the interaction between different aspects of pedagogy and content, content and technology, or technology and pedagogy. So it involves pattern recognition. And again, it takes time, it takes a bit more work to do pattern recognition than it does to look at direct application than at the upper, as you did at the lower levels. So for teachers who say, well, geez, it is a little more difficult, yeah, that's fine. No reason, it's not a reason to become discouraged. Everybody finds it a little more difficult to go from augmentation to modification and then modification to redefinition than it does from substitution to augmentation. It's important to know that because sometimes I know people get discouraged. So this is a don't get discouraged. You know, there's good stuff to come. All right. So here's what I would like to do. We're at the end of our time, and since we started a little bit late, I'm not going to have quite as much time to cover the last few slides as I would. So instead of doing the full description of the ladder, let me just do a quick overview of the slides and then give people a chance to ask some questions. So very briefly, there was a study that came out some months back that said, well, geez, it looks like students get better results from taking notes by hand than they do with a laptop. And I went back and I reviewed that study and found that while that seemed to be what's going on in the study, that wasn't quite the whole story. I found, in fact, that what was happening was the students were using very poor note-taking strategies on both their by hand and by laptop, and that, you know, because they were just doing straight transcription of videos they were watching. And sure, if you have really bad strategies, frankly, bad pedagogy, then I guess paper does work better than the laptop. But that's not really a fair comparison. What we like to compare is best note-taking strategies across the board. So the last set of SAMR slides I have here refer to the fact that you can look at strategies that are based upon good note-taking strategies on paper that can be made even better if you use the technology appropriately. So very briefly, at the substitution level, you can give students outlines of what it is you're going to talk about, your slides, charts, and have them annotated. And that's known to be an effective practice, particularly for students who are newcomers. So the technology, the straight substitution, you could have annotated photocopies instead of what you have on your tablet, but it works just as well on a tablet as it does on paper because you can now have a good note-taking strategy, namely basing note-taking upon charts, outlines, etc., given to you by teacher. At the augmentation level, there are several possibilities. You could use concept maps, as you see at the top, with all the affordances I already described in the Sherlock Holmes example, to take notes as well and to link, you know, as you're listening to a talk, link resources, sketches, slides into the picture. And one of the things that I will mention here is there is some data that seems to show that concept maps, whether on paper or digitally, in this case augmented, right, seem to work better not for students who are complete newcomers to a subject as note-taking, but rather for students who already have some experience of the subject. So they're great tools, very powerful tools for note-taking, but there is a little bit of a caveat, which is they may not be the best tool for students who are complete newcomers to an area. At the bottom, for instance, you have a tool, this happens to be Notability, but there are others, which allows me to say, well, what if I have a student taking notes as they're listening to a lecture, and they were able to record the lecture and then synchronize their note-taking to the lecture. So if they have, say, a place where they took some notes and they said, wait, did I get that right? Just by clicking on the note, they can go to that portion of the recorded lecture and again, hear that said again. And for all students, this is, of course, a way to augment traditional note-taking. But in particular, for students with different types of learning challenges, this may become an essential way for them to do this. Also, at the augmentation level, you can have applications that take handwritten notes, as in the case here of this equation, and have them transform into typeset notes, which already enhances legibility, understandability, comprehensibility of the notes, but also connects them to tools like Wolfram Alpha. So what used to be a passive note becomes a gateway and entry point into further exploration of the concept. At the modification level, we can say, well, why should note-taking always be an individual thing? Couldn't we make social note-taking? Like earlier, we were talking about doing social writing, and the answer is yes. So for instance, you can use Twitter or Today's Meet or whatever tool you prefer to have students jointly take notes on something. And I have to tell you, for instance, I've seen this used extremely successfully in the state of Maine, for instance, at Auburn Middle School, where students have become so good at doing this type of live shared note-taking that the school has teams of students that then go to local events and take notes at them and record effectively those events in this summarized note-taking fashion for other people to use. It's very powerful. You have to, of course, make sure that there aren't students that are just sort of sitting back and not taking notes and just depending on the other students. So you have to do some, okay, on this day, students X, Y, and Z are going to definitely be taking notes, etc. But again, the fact that students can be complementing each other's notes rather than all just doing exactly the same thing in parallel, that one can be acting to, say, source other materials while other students are knowing nuances of what has been said or discussed, is a very powerful concept indeed. And finally, at the redefinition level, we can look at tools that take those notes and transform them into something else. So now those notes are not just sitting there in a student's notebook and, well, that student got some mileage out of them, but nobody else did. Why do that? We've already set the stage, for instance, with the previous social note-taking. So as you see in the upper part of the screen, you can use social tools, social visualization tools, to visualize a map. This is a social network map, really a concept map of different notes that we're taking on a given topic. The tool is called Tags Explorer. And as always, I should emphasize, I don't show things that wouldn't it be nice if you could do this. That's something that was done by people taking notes on this course. It's called Thought Vectors in Concept Space. It was an online course. And they use tools like this one to take that social note-taking aspect through Twitter that I mentioned before and integrate it in rich ways that allowed for seeing patterns, connections among notes that couldn't have been seen otherwise. At the bottom, you have iTunes U. And many institutions have used iTunes U and other venues to share collections of notes, etc., by students in the form of books. So what happens is those notes, somewhat lightly edited, can become books that then can be shared with an audience well beyond the walls of your particular institution, well beyond that particular classroom, which once again, one last time I'll mention this, gives students an authentic audience and a reason to just make those notes not just something that is, well, I'll use them for the exam and then I throw them away, but really gets into the understanding of the subject. So that's an example of how to use the type of thinking I was talking about in the TPAC context. If you think about each of these levels, you'll see the connections to the different intersections that I mentioned before. No, not now as a formal ladder like the other two examples I gave you, but in the context of saying how can a practice, note-taking, be made most effective by use of the technology. So that's it for what I wanted to talk about today. You've seen SAMR. You've seen the technologies that you can bring to the table, a classification of technologies, the EdTech Quintet, that you can use to bring SAMR into practice, and then TPAC to help inform where you should be focusing both your search for resources, but also your thinking processes as you go up SAMR levels. You've seen 3 examples, 2 of them focused around a particular topic area in a course, and 1 focused around the practice to show you different ways in which you can bring the technology to the table. In closing, before I take questions, I wanted to mention that I've created 3 challenges for those of you who choose to follow them. following upon what we discussed today. So the challenges go to progressively higher levels of SAMR. At the substitution level, I'd like you to use some tools. You've got the list here in the slides, #ify and wellness SAMR solo, to search for either a topic of current event of interest to you or a topic that you might like to teach or your students are interested in on Twitter and related feeds, and then to find more resources about it, find out more things about it. For instance, for a current event, the earthquake in Nepal is absolutely tragic, and it has been very, I think, enlightening and I would say hope-creating to see how different groups have reacted in different ways to different needs generated by the earthquake. And that's something that has been visible through Google that frankly might not be visible through a lot of the news accounts, which seem to be just focusing on certain, so to say, traditional newspaper aspects that don't convey the full human story, if you will. So at the substitution to augmentation level, use those to start to see not just not just do a straight search the way you would on Google, but to start to see patterns, connections. Let me show you what those two tools look like very briefly on screen. If you do a search on a hashtag, you'll get other hashtags connected to it, as well as people, as well as other searches. The difference between the two is #ify is more focused on what just happened now. #ify is focused on not what's just happening now, but what's happened over time up till now, while bottlenose SAMR solo is focused on what's happening right now. So they have different scopes and they have different uses that you might find particularly powerful. To take this to an augmentation modification level, see if you can then take what you found out and create your own mini thread that encompasses what you found out, share it out with other people. I suggested using WordPress here, but you can also use Storify as a way of chaining tweets and other social media elements. And I would encourage you to let the media speak for itself, let the resources speak for themselves as you embed them into the stream, and use just enough text to contextualize the flow from one tweet to the next, one resource to the next within your WordPress blog, so that others can better understand what's going on. And then, of course, tweet out, use the hashtag #eLearnedOn to let others know that you've created this. And then finally, the third challenge is at modification to redefinition. Find others to work with. You've all tagged those blogs you created based upon the resources you found using these visual search tools, visual analysis tools for Twitter and other resources. So now find at least 2 to 3 other fellow educators that have similar or connected interests. And between all of you say, well, now that we've found these resources, how might we use this in the classroom? So create a draft. Just give yourselves 1 hour. Use a Google Hangout to get together, so you're not wondering, okay, so I'm on this side of the province and you're on that side of the province, what have you. But rather say, okay, so we'll get together and we'll rough out a quick and dirty SAMR lab that would use what we found out in some interesting way with our students. It's just an exercise, it's not something, and then you have to implement it, although by all means, if you choose to implement it, that would be great. But it'll help you transform these resources that then you integrate it into the form of this digital storytelling narrative through WordPress or Storify, etc., into an actual tool of practice in a classroom. And once you've done that, again, make it available through a blog, although if you're feeling adventurous, you could choose digital video or what have you as well, and share it out with others and use the hashtag #eLearnedOn to share what you have. So that's it. I hope this presentation on SAMR has been useful to you, and I really hope to see some of you take up the challenges. I did make them so each one of them builds upon the previous one. So if this time around you just feel like doing the first one, that's great. But do dip a toe in the water. I think you'll find it's fun. One last thing. I mentioned that I would give you the address where you can download these slides, and here it is at the top. I assume this will also be linked into any other messages about this talk series. But if you go to hippasus.com/blog, you'll find these slides available for download, as well as slides from any other presentation I've given over many, many years. All my slides are available under Creative Commons. So you should feel free to share them with people, remix them, reuse them in any way you like. The only one thing I ask is, of course, that you give credit. So I want to thank you all again for coming to this virtual presentation, and I'd like to see perhaps if we have a couple of minutes to take some questions.
So. Hi, Ruben. Thank you very much. You clearly know your stuff very well. It's Joe Russo, e-learning coordinator with the Toronto Catholic District School Board. I've got a tweet here that I'd like to share with you regarding a question.
Please. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can get this. Okay. If we design a test thinking it's one level of SAMR, is it possible it could turn out to be another depending on the student? Absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you, Vicky. That's a really, really good question. The answer is yes. And let me give you a concrete example from the research. If you use what are sometimes called living books, a living book is a book that's been augmented by adding things like pronunciation guides. Maybe the book gets read out loud by not just this voice synthesis engine, by narrators that act it out. You might have some video, images, definitions linked in. So this is all augmentation level for the average student. Great. But here's the story. In some of the research that's been done, students that have different types of reading challenges have been introduced to this type of book. And what's happened now is that they can go much further with a well-designed augmented living book than they could before. So if you have a student with dyslexia, for instance, that before you would say, well, they can only handle texts of a certain complexity, and because of the scope of the task, we'll only ask them to undertake the following tasks to use the text. What the research has shown is that now these students can take on tasks that you would not necessarily have asked of them, because without the technology, they could not necessarily have undertaken them. So for those students with different types of reading challenges in this particular scenario, the task is not at the augmentation level, but at the modification level, because in fact it represents a significant change to what they were being asked to read and what they were being asked to do with what they read. So the bottom line is that indeed, for one student, a test might just reach a certain level, but for another student, it could reach a different level. Let me mention one other aspect that's connected to this, and that is the aspect of do the upper levels always have to depend upon the computer technology? So for instance, you had digital storytelling in some of the examples I showed you, right? The visualization tools for the network of tweets as note-taking and so on. The answer is that's a possibility, but it's not necessarily always the case. Let me give you an example from a colleague of mine, Steven Siegel, who teaches music composition. And Steven's students reach incredibly advanced levels of understanding development in their practice as both composers and performers. Great. And you look at their final performance, the performance that wraps up their course of music learning, and I would indeed say it's at redefinition level, because the complexity and richness and thoughtfulness of the music they compose is far beyond what you would have seen in a course that did not involve the computer technology, and the performance quality is also far above. Here's the thing, though. That final performance takes place, well, it's just classical music performed on classical instruments. And you say, wait a second, where's the computer there? Well, it might be used to display the score, but that's not necessarily the key thing. The key thing is that they use at the other levels of SAMR, of the technology. So the students, for instance, practiced intensively using music synthesis tools, composed many variations, many more than you would have traditionally done on paper and pencil, and then heard their different variations played for them by the synthesizer in the computer, explored using ear training tools, different aspects of music melody, including the type of thing that before would have been difficult because if there was no recording available to it and you couldn't get that, say, string quartet available to you to see what happened when these two particular melodic strands came together. In other words, that type of work at the other three levels of SAMR made possible at the redefinition level, something that used a technology indeed to a level in a way that would not have been possible before. But in this particular case, the technology happened to be classical instruments on a classical music score. So it's also important to realize that sometimes what the computer technology can do is set the stage for other technologies. And yes, a violin is a technology and a very complex one. And for those of you who follow the Google Doodles, there was a tribute to the inventor of the piano, and the pianoforte, with the whole range of volume it can produce, is a hugely complex technology. Well, what the computer technology does in this case is make those technologies usable in a way they could not have without the use of this technology. So that's another important aspect to realize, that sometimes the redefinition level or even other levels are what other technologies can be made to do, if you will, if you use the computer technology appropriately.
Thank you, Ruben. I learned a lot tonight. Someone else has a question, I believe?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. If you could. Jeff, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I can see that you're talking, but your microphone doesn't seem to be working. And now you're muted, I'm afraid. Okay. Sorry, I still can't hear you. Could you try typing into the group chat, maybe?
Since Jeff is having some technical issues there, Ruben, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
There were just a couple of other questions, but given the time, I think maybe we'll go with just one more. And the question comes from Bia Maglio from eLearning Ontario. And she wants to know, what strategies would you use to help teachers move beyond a simple linear application of SAMR? So I see, and I see Jeff there has his question popped up as well. But perhaps if you start with Bia's, then maybe, Jeff, we can pick that up if there's time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so let me start with Bia's question first. Again, that's an excellent question. How do you get teachers to move beyond? One of the key elements is to encourage people to work together, work in teams. And I have to admit, the third aspect, the third challenge that I created for today has that as a key goal. In general, when you have yourself working alone, it's very easy to just think, oh, yeah, I'm going to do this, and just think of one channel, one approach. If you can get a group of 4 people together, and my experience is somewhere between 3 and 5 seems to work best, and say, okay, let's just get together, maybe do this over lunch or over coffee or what have you, and just hash out what could we be, play a little bit with the idea, what could the SAMR ladder look like? I find that the interaction between teachers works very well to get people thinking beyond that linear aspect. So that's one element I would strongly encourage. And another element I strongly encourage is directly connected with this, and that is to have people talk not just with people in their own subject area if they're in high school or just at their grade level in the elementary grades, but actually talk across subject areas, across grade levels, because what happens? Well, tools like SAMR, TPAC, the EdTech Quintet give you a common language for discussing things. So you can have people with very different goals, but they might be talking about elements that, if they can ground that in the language of SAMR, TPAC, and the EdTech Quintet, they can see new thoughts, new ideas they might not have otherwise. So for instance, a sports teacher might want to use timelines to work with a soccer team to say, how should your strategy evolve throughout the game, and use timelines to visualize that. A history teacher might want to use timelines to visualize a series of historical events. A biology teacher might want to use timelines to visualize, say, in the process of cell division, the stages of cell division. They all are using timelines for very different things. If you just had them come together, just talk about their own individual topics without the language of SAMR, TPAC, EdTech Quintet, and just say, well, I'm teaching this, I'm teaching that, it might be a nice conversation. But the key element that SAMR and TPAC can bring to the table is when they're saying, well, let me discuss how I'm using timelines in this context using this language. They can each learn from each other, and because they're not all in the same subject area, again, you start to get those aha moments saying, wait, you're doing this in history, I can use that in soccer. We're doing 2 different things, but the type of thinking, how you approach it, how you build successive uses of the technology based upon it will evolve. So that's another element that I find helps. And last but far from least, if you're working with teachers for this, the more diverse examples you can show, the better. And that's one of the reasons why I make all my slides available. Most of my examples are tend to be straight SAMR ladders, just because they're the most compact, easiest to explain in a short period of time. But if you look through my slides, I have some on app flows as well. And if you look at ISTE and other people's presentations on app flows, you'll find complex interactions, some of the app smashing work as well, that goes beyond straight linear application, again, gets people to diversify. So thank you, that's a great question. And finally, we have here Jeff's question, and it says, when showing people SAMR, people seem to become fixated on the technology tools. What tool will be used in order to do the high-level task? Well, I'm suggesting, it seems to me you're suggesting what equally important is the pedagogy and the teacher talent as systems leader. How do we continue making this aspect prominent in technology professional development? Absolutely, Jeff. That is exactly what I'm saying. In other words, it's too easy to become fixed on, I will use this tool. Don't get me wrong. It's important to choose a good tool. You don't want to be stymied, if you will, by bad tools or the lack of tools. But at the end of the day, the key element is the pedagogy and how that teacher, that PCK aspect that Schulman identified. Schulman said, among many things he said over the years about PCK, that's where sometimes you see change processes in institutions and schools get stuck because the PCK aspect is not being duly attended to, is not being well supported. So when you're asking me as system leaders, how do you continue making this aspect prominent? I strongly suggest putting emphasis, whether via professional development or stimulating conversations among teachers, or making sure that teachers have their own personal learning networks using whichever tools they like. For one, it might be Twitter, another Facebook, another LinkedIn, another might be professional organizations, what have you, that this aspect of pedagogical content knowledge is stressed, emphasized throughout. If anything, in fact, I frequently recommend when people are starting to develop a SAMR ladder or any use of technology, to not start from the technology, but rather say, take a step back. Do you see aspects that you really wish were stronger in terms of what you're doing with this that are not there? An aspect of the content that you say, I never seem to get to it. I wish I could. That's a good aspect, because now you're thinking, well, why is that content going to be better for your students to understand? How will you as a teacher represent that? Okay, so it's a PCK question. Or when you have students getting stymied, getting blocked on a given unit of content, once again, that's a PCK question. Start there. Not, if you're teaching math, I strongly recommend start with, what is it that you wish the students would understand about the math that they don't? How will you, as in your role as teacher, contextualize that? And then bring in the technology to say, how will the technology make it possible for me to do that? In the example I showed you for system dynamics, that's a perfect example. Without the tool, there's only so much I can do. I can help the students understand some things, I can give them some interesting little thought problems, but at the end of the day, if I want to get into a rich understanding of how stocks and flows work and some of the sometimes paradoxical aspects of how systems work, I need to be thinking about this from the perspective of how the tool makes it possible, but it's a PCK question at heart. What the tool does is it makes it possible for me to address that aspect of how do I rethink how system dynamics works for a student so the student can better understand it, etc. in a way. That's what technology is doing, and the core thinking is how will I as the teacher rethink that presentation so it is better, more usable, more useful to the student.
So thank you, Ruben. That was very interesting. I'm wondering if you have time to take one additional question. It's
Sure.
come up a couple of times, and I'm going to try this. I'm not sure we're learning with everyone else. I'm not sure if people can see it, but it's from @Tech Ambassador Dan Martinik, and he has indicated he loves this question. He wants to know, is there a SAMR for assessment?
That's a great question. Right now, I have done some work on ways of looking at the products you create in the course of, say, designing a unit of instruction using SAMR for formative assessment. I've done quite a bit of work on that in that regard. There is not a separate scale or anything like that, but I will refer you to the work of somebody whose work I find can be integrated very readily with SAMR and works beautifully, and that's the work of Dylan William. It's Dylan, D-Y-L-A-N, and then William, W-I-L-I-A-M. And Dylan William has done a great job, I think, of creating some matrices for thinking about formative assessment that again, when you have those side by side with SAMR, you can do some very, very interesting things. And I strongly encourage people to use them side by side. I do.
Awesome. That was very interesting. So thank you very much. Just before we go, I wanted to say thank you very much to Ruben. I certainly enjoyed your explanation of SAMR, and the categorization methodology was especially interesting. I know that the GTA boards, we've been working very hard to ground our work in both SAMR, TPAC, and as well as your EdTech, QuinTech, and it's been an essential component within my board to help teachers integrate technology more fully into their curriculum. I know that was also, a lot of the commenting on Twitter was related to that as well. I also want to thank you because I found that the reiteration, the reminder that it is a ladder, and that there's really, each rung has its own place. Each rung is important as a key message, was very valuable because I find often teachers, myself included, get stuck trying to redefine everything. And I think the focus on learning goals and categories, certainly it reminds me to keep those in the forefront of my mind when I'm planning. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that we do have an e-community that we hope you'll join. We have information on the upcoming speakers, the dates and topics, as well as challenges to help you move forward with 21st century teaching and learning. That's where challenges that Ruben has shared tonight will be found. We have discussion boards, and Ruben, if it's okay, I'm going to link to your work from that, so it's all in one place. And finally, the video from tonight will be posted there as well, so teachers or individuals that are wanting to reflect on it or come back to it at a later time, it will be there. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ruben. That was amazing. And I want to encourage everyone else. We have another session here on May 19th. It will be Dr. Jennifer Jensen from York University who will be discussing game-based learning and the gamification of education. And Ruben, you're welcome to join us.
Thank you. I'd love to. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.